Everybody, welcome back to another episode of Besides the Revolution podcast. Matt and I have been connected over the course of the last couple of years through the Kennedy campaign, and we've had some conversations in the past. And I'm really fascinated because I know kind of his world into politics all sort of started around the JFK assassination. And so, Matt, I'm really glad to have you with us. I wanted to talk both a little bit deeper dive into the JFK files and the RFK files. And I think they're both really interesting things that have come out, and there's some things there. And I think, contrary to the popular narrative around it, there's probably a lot more there. And I think it'd be great to talk about it. So, Matt, thanks for being with us, and thanks for talking today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Matt, tell me a little bit, as these things have been kind of trickling out and released. What have you noticed? Let's maybe start with JFK, and what have you noticed about it?
Yeah, I'll start with the media spin. Right, the media is telling everyone there's nothing there. Right, if you're to trust the Washington Post and the New York Times, it's all nothing burgers. But if you actually dive down into the files, you find there's quite a bit. The most famous files that I think many of your readers or listeners, viewers, will be conversant with would be the Joanides files and the Schlesinger memo. But also, I think much more interesting, at least from my point of view, is the file that was initially released, partially redacted in 2022, called the CIA Dimensions of Brown and Root. It was fully uncensored in 2025, giving us a window into Lyndon Johnson's social network, the company that funded him, the CEO of that company, the founder of that company, George Brown of Brown and Root, who was Lyndon's paymaster, and who sort of famously said, "Whether it's right or wrong, Lyndon, I'm with you." And more interesting maybe than all of that, because there is a real CIA-LBJ divide in the JFK assassination research community, this document shows you that Lyndon Johnson's social network, the Brown and Root Corporation, had numerous CIA assets. So I think a lot of folks want to talk about LBJ over here, CIA over here, but if you actually dive down into the financial records of Lyndon Johnson's world, you see that many of his people had security clearance, many of them were domestic contacts with the CIA, and many of them were even foreign contacts. And that's what this particular file shows. It really not only unearths this social network and maps it in really interesting detail, but I'd say it does something else. It shows you in 1967, that's when this memo dropped, it shows you that the CIA was very concerned that people were looking in to Lyndon Johnson. They decided to classify this memo, which was really just a statement of fear on the agency's behalf about the fact that a magazine, Ramparts magazine, was looking in to Lyndon Johnson. So they considered a study of Lyndon Johnson radioactive enough that their private conversations about it were censored. So very briefly, the Joanides file. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, so I think that's a really interesting point because, you got the Roger Stone side of the things, which is like he's convinced Lyndon did it or had a lot to do with it. And then I think you've got this other sort of world, which I think is more kind of Oliver Stone-ish, which is the CIA world was really a piece of it. I don't know that those two things, and this is becoming more and more apparent the more you get into things like the Epstein files and the more you get into stuff like even just this sort of latest stuff with Tulsi's world about kind of the CIA's involvement around, the sort of 2016 Russia hoax.
Yeah.
When you start to break it apart, you realize these guys are always kind of moving in and back and forth between each other. The administrative state, intelligence operatives, they're never really, no one's ever going to find a thing that says this guy from the CIA did this thing. It's just they're too complex. I'm curious if that's what you're seeing in that conversation.
Yeah, and there's a sort of conceptual term for that awakening, to how the world really works. It's coined by a scholar named Peter Dale Scott, It's called deep politics. And Scott's idea in a nutshell is that we have establishment politics, i.e., conventional politics, that says Republicans over here, Democrats over here, CIA over here, FBI over here, mafia down there. These are all separate worlds. Lyndon Johnson here, CIA over there. Peter Dale Scott says, well, that's bullshit. If you actually pull back the curtain and look at the way the world works, we see that Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, are neighbors. And they are working with FBI agents who are cross-referenced in CIA files and who were former CIA agents, or there are CIA agents who are former FBI agents. And they're using informants who happen to work in the underworld, and not just the American underworld. Also, the underworlds of places like Italy, France, Corsica, Nicaragua, so on and so forth. In a nutshell, deep politics means everything's connected. This is what novelists have been screaming for years. Everything's connected, but it applies to politics too.
So interesting. So curious. Let's kind of talk down that road a little bit about that memo that you were just mentioning.
Yeah.
Why do you find that to be kind of a smoking gun's the wrong word, but something really kind of making that real deep connection there? Why is that? Why does that memo sort of spell it out?
Yeah. I don't think any single document is a smoking gun. And I think that's a point that needs to be made over and over again. That the only way we achieve a kind of credible conclusion in this is through consilience, through all of these different independent sources being evaluated cumulatively, a real big picture analysis. But that single document is, I think, really illuminating, because the fundamental divide of the JFK assassination research community, as I've seen it, and I've been somebody who's been reading in this world since I was 13 years old. You know, since 1991, I've been reading the books haphazardly at first and with much more sort of focus over the last 10 years. And I see this over and over again, and I hear it from the people I interview in the community. There is, as you say, the Roger Stone community on one side and the Oliver Stone community on the other side. And it is a divide that suggests the Lyndon Johnson world and the Lyndon Johnson conspiracy theory is one narrative, and the CIA conspiracy theory is another. Well, this is binary thinking. This is something that I think Peter Dale Scott actually has very little patience with, and I think the rest of us should have very little patience with. These worlds are married, they are entangled, and that document, the CIA Dimensions of Brown and Root, shows, it makes sensible, it maps for anyone who cares to look, that these worlds very closely were not just intermixing in a scholarly treatise in the 21st century, that they were operationally entangled while Lyndon Johnson was president and while he was overseeing the censorship of the Kennedy case in real time, the very year before MLK and RFK are also assassinated. Johnson was profoundly concerned, and so was the CIA.
And that's an interesting thing. Johnson's, role in the government is, I think people in now, without any sort of historic context, don't really understand how massive Johnson's influence was in Washington.
That's right.
It's a very, very significant aspect of the Washington culture from sort of Great Depression era through his sort of leaving of the White House. That's a 40-year window of a career, and he's very, very connected. I'm always fascinated, and the longer that I've gotten into this, the more I've looked into sort of Washington politics, how deeply connected everything is. You're seeing it in the Maxwell case,
Yep.
and you're seeing it in the Epstein case. You're seeing that all these people point to one another, and there's suddenly this guy's involved over here and he's over here, but he's also involved strangely in the Trump-Russia collusion hoax. It's all this kind of very interested sort of incestuous relationships. What do you think that has done to our ability as a culture to sort of really get to the bottom of what happened in 1963?
I think it has utterly compromised our ability to get to the bottom of it because many of us, and I say us, the media, right? I'm somebody who has written as a war reporter for a newspaper. I'm somebody who's written for local newspapers here in Greensboro. I've written for magazines, literary journals. I've done it all. I've published books with national and international houses and smaller houses. I've been behind the curtain of these worlds. They hate this story. They hate the JFK story because it reveals their complicity in the cover up. All right. This cannot be stated more emphatically. This reveals not just fascinating connections between LBJ and the CIA, it shows that many of us in media are getting our money from these same underground, laundered networks that were being hatched in that very moment. 1967, CIA Dimensions of Brown and Root. You get down into the grain of that document and you see that the CIA is terrified that they are about to be revealed for funding these charities through Brown and Root and through Johnson's network. That Johnson is already at that moment starting to repurpose our money, taxpayer money, towards CIA charities, right? This is a precursor, as you say, to the stuff we're seeing with Epstein, what Mike Benz talks about all the time with USAID. Johnson was repurposing this network of, I think, initially charitable organizations, agencies that were designed to help liberate other countries, like USAID, hatched under Kennedy. And he was basically turning them into money laundering operations for his own cronies in the CIA.
There's a great line from the Oliver Stone movie when they're sitting on the bench and he says, well, that's the deal, isn't it? That's the why. All the other stuff is just, kind of window dressing and theater to cover up the why. What, as you've gone through this, what do you think is the why? Is there a motive that you're seeing? Some sort of, I know there's a lot of thoughts about why Jack was so hated, I guess, in terms of his kind of resistance to this, the Dulles brothers and the sort of oversight of this, like the administrative state's sort of infancy that's developing. I know there's a lot about that, but are you seeing more in there that's related to answering that deeper question of why?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if I'm sitting here with a bunch of academics, I know that we could take this into a territory that would be utterly indecipherable for a lot of listeners and viewers. There are complex whys we could talk about that might be very illuminating for this 1%, but I think if we really want to get to the nuts and bolts of it, it is about something we can all relate to: survival. And let me tell you what I mean by that. It's about power and survival, holding on to power, surviving as a powerful network. In many cases, maybe just surviving as a free man, surviving as somebody who gets to wake up in the morning and go to work, right? For Lyndon Johnson, this was about survival. He was being investigated in the fall of 1963 under the Bobby Baker scandal, which we can talk about later if you'd like. He was being investigated in his own home state for the murder of USDA investigator Henry Marshall. Another thing we could talk about later. He was being actively investigated by his own boss, the president, and the Attorney General, RFK. Bobby Kennedy was funneling documents to the Senate Rules Committee in November of 1963, who were investigating Lyndon Johnson and Bobby Baker and Johnson's whole corrupt network that, again, we see in the CIA Dimensions of Brown and Root. The Kennedys are investigating their own government. They are about to retire J. Edgar Hoover. They've already retired Allen Dulles, and they are about to put Lyndon Johnson either in prison or they are going to compel him to drop off the ticket, and they're going to replace him. I'm here in North Carolina. We have a little stake in this. They were going to replace him with Governor Sanford, Terry Sanford of North Carolina. Lyndon Johnson was about to lose his job and perhaps his freedom. I don't think anybody needs to understand a motive more fundamental than that. He was at war with the Kennedys, and he won, at least in the short term.
He's a powerful guy. I just don't know that people really understand. I don't think there's a player like it in Washington today.
Nope.
I mean, Washington's become much more neutered and sort of feckless. They have their power, they have their stuff, but I don't think anybody understands the kind of character that Johnson had become. I mean, he is the most powerful person in the Senate when he's nominated for vice president.
Can I say something to that? Can I say something to that? Yeah. Because I think what you're saying about him, about everything being so neutered right now, is absolutely true. But you got to ask yourself, why are things so neutered? Why do things seem so feckless and impotent and powerless? And I think if you look at Johnson, what gave him such power, in many ways, he was doing every day what you and I are doing right now, right? You and I do not, I think, identify identically in our politics, but we find common ground. Lyndon Johnson, if you want to sort of look at him favorably, he was a guy who broke bread with everyone, right? Whether you were a Republican, a Democrat, an FDR Democrat, a JFK Democrat, a Barry Goldwater Republican, whoever you were, if you could help Lyndon Johnson get a deal done that might bring some pork to his people, he would work with you, right? He's famous for saying, I don't want a policeman, I want a partner, when he would talk about these Kennedy Democrats who were starting to investigate him.
Right.
He did not like to be surveilled. Of course, nobody does. This is a contemporary temptation to just eschew oversight. But I think one of the things that we see, and it probably gave rise to Bobby Jr.'s candidacy in 2024, was we live in a hyper siloed world, right? We live in this increasingly antisocial, desocialized world. The pandemic made it so bad. And so we see politicians, not just post-pandemic, but I think the internet has done this too with their algorithms that are tuned to tribalism. They have made all of us, to some extent, like Barack Obama or Donald Trump, you know, people who just talk to their base and preach to their choirs. Trump, to give him a little bit of credit, seems to be moving away from that by bringing people like Tulsi and Bobby into his network. But this is what I see as a Democrat all the time. We are doubling down on the bubble. We are not being, in the good way, Lyndon Johnson Democrats who work across the aisle constantly. We are just doubling down on division.
I totally resonate with that. And as you say, you know, you and I probably at least start this journey towards some of our affinity for Bobby Jr., we start from a very different perspective, but I think it comes to this place of what Washington probably used to be like now. There's some real negatives that come out of a Lyndon Johnson power world that becomes and develops out of that. But I think it is interesting to see that power that he grabbed was because of those things. You know, Hale Boggs world in the Southern kind of, pre-civil rights world he's very comfortable in. He's also comfortable as Jack's VP. He's also comfortable in the Texas world, which is its own brand of politics. And it is a very fascinating thing to see what happens. I'm really curious, that kind of pressure that the Kennedys were putting on government for disclosure, that sort of, whether it's the Alan Dulles stuff, this sort of, I want to just shatter the CIA into a million pieces comment that Jack's famous for saying. Why do you think Johnson took that so personally?
I think he took that personally because that was his network of power. Again, to bring it back to the CIA dimensions of Brown and Root, if you are going to put the microscope like those journalists at Ramparts were doing in 1967, and like the Kennedys were doing in 63 and 62, and as early as 61, if you're putting the microscope on the CIA and saying, critical thinking is going to be applicable across the board here. We're going to reform government. We're going to look at corruption, and the CIA does not get a pass. Everything is potentially fair game if we're going to clean up our government. And Kennedy realized, both the Kennedy brothers realized that. And I think that brings us to another important document in the recent drop. That is the Schlesinger memo that shows, I believe, as early as 1961 from Schlesinger to Kennedy that the agency was becoming a quote unquote state within the state. And this is powerful because the quote you bring up earlier about Kennedy saying he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and cast it to the wind. There are scholars who say, oh, he never really said that. It's not, it's not on audio tape. But this memo shows exactly that concern early in his presidency, after the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy saw the CIA as a problem. He wanted to reform it. He wanted to cut it. And he wanted it out of its sort of militant adventurism and doing a very basic thing, and that was providing intelligence to the president. Not an entity with a sovereignty of its own that could be overthrowing democratically elected leaders all over the world, but an entity that was there to develop sources and provide intelligence. The fact that the CIA found that to be radioactive, that criticism of their agency, it's revealing.
For sure. Tell me, I'm always curious, some of the underlying things, like the 2 investigations you're talking about, Johnson being investigated for. I think Johnson, it speaks to his sort of hubris. I don't think I think he thought he was completely above all of this. Probably whatever level of involvement he had within the assassination itself, I think he just very much felt like he was above it, could get around it all, because he had demonstrated for a 40-year career that he could. Tell me about those 2 investigations, why those are pressing and why they matter.
Yeah. So let's start with the first one, right? The Billy Celestes scandal. When I was growing up and my mother introduced me to a lot of this stuff, she would always bring up this name, Billy Celestes. She would also always talk about E. Howard Hunt. My mom was a little bit of a buff. She was interested in this story, as a lot of JFK Democrats were. So Billy Celestes was not just a crony of Lyndon Johnson. Well before that, he was a young man who was an incredible farmer. He actually, I think, was the FFA Farmer of the Year in 1943. Met Franklin Roosevelt, was sort of given that award by President Roosevelt. He was a great farmer, and he was one of the bright young men of the mid-20th century, and he became part of Johnson's social network. And Johnson started using him through the Department of Agriculture, through this cotton allotment scheme, to start providing kickbacks to his social network. Again, Brown and Root, CIA dimensions of Brown and Root. Where was this money coming from? It was coming from everywhere. It was also coming from Texas in these agricultural kickback schemes. Problem, however, was there was a USDA investigator named Henry Marshall who saw what Johnson was doing. And Johnson initially tried to buy him off, tried to give him a promotion, tried to dangle the carrot rather than use the stick. But Marshall couldn't be bought. And so Billy Celestes, many years later, admitted to being at a meeting where the hit was ordered. And I think Estes may have even been one of the murderers. But Henry Marshall received a visit. And he got 5 bullets. And it was declared a suicide. 5-bullet suicide, Aaron. That's what they call a Texas suicide. 5 bullets. I mean, even J. Edgar Hoover's on the record saying he'd never seen anything like it. And it took the heroic legwork of a Texas Ranger named Clint Peoples, who, like, on behalf of the Marshall family over the course of 20 years, finally got that coroner's report reversed from suicide to homicide. And Billy Celestes, in 1984, in front of a Robertson grand jury, says Johnson is responsible for 10 murders. You know, in the recent Cliff Carter tape, I think the number's 17. But in this Robertson County grand jury, Billy Celestes puts Johnson on the hook for 10 murders, one of them being Henry Marshall, another being John F. Kennedy. Now, after Billy Celestes, or while Billy Celestes is not only being investigated, but apparently conversant with Bobby Kennedy, helping Bobby Kennedy in limited ways in his investigation of Johnson. Then you get Bobby Baker and the Bobby Baker scandal of 62 and 63, which reveals to us this sort of analogy, this parallel figure to Jeffrey Epstein. Right? Bobby Baker is a wheeler and a dealer. He's a guy who's helping powerful people launder money, but he's also a sex trafficker. He is also running a club called the Quorum Club, and he is running party girls, prostitutes, through the Quorum Club, and is even able to hook JFK up to an East German gal named Ellen Rometsch, who is still alive to this day. They were trying to blackmail JFK, and Bobby saw it happening and had Ellen Rometsch deported in 63, late summer, I think early fall of 63, before the assassination, because he saw what fire both his brother and the Johnson network were playing with. I think he saw all of this coming. He and Johnson were at absolute war with each other. Bobby and LBJ, much more so than JFK and LBJ, but I think LBJ saw the real politics of how to win the fight. And that was to kill the president, you know, to cut off the head of the snake. And by doing so, rendering RFK useless, worse, you know, desperate.
Which worked. I mean, Bobby was devastated and really it kind of retained the role, but never really recovered from it at all. It took him getting away from Washington and, then becoming a senator to even kind of have a vision of coming back to Washington as a president. So I'd say it clearly worked. It is interesting to me, the patterns in Washington are always the same, right? Power does this to men and women. It turns them into people who they were otherwise not designed to be, which is just kind of this mantle of power that they can't bear. Are there other things that you found that sort of speak to this networking world of Washington and sort of, as you described, there's this kind of sex trafficking aspect to it. And I know there's a mafia aspect to it, and then there's this powerful aspect to it. Are there other things that you're seeing in what has been released that really do sort of put that spider web, that sort of, I guess I call this sort of the birth of the administrative state? I mean, I know it's happening before then, but this really is, they get away with it. There's never any consequence for the assassination. There's a coup in the wide open streets of Dallas, and no one ever really has any suffering for it. What are you seeing in relationship to that? If you could drag Oswald into this too, I think that'd be a fascinating aspect of this as well.
Yeah, let's talk about another trove of documents as a way of answering that question. The Joanides files, right? This just came to us this month. And what does it reveal? Well, it reveals a lot about Lee Harvey Oswald. In a nutshell, it reveals that he was a CIA asset being monitored by a CIA agent named George Joanides. Why does this matter? The CIA denied this for 62 years. Worse, they hired Joanides, not just hired, they brought him out of retirement in 1978 to be the liaison to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And he used that position to stonewall the investigators and to lie to them and to continue this narrative of, oh no, we know nothing about Lee Harvey Oswald, in spite of the fact that he, Joanides, not only was monitoring Oswald, but was using an alias, Howard Gebler, to do so. Joanides, my God, he got an award from the CIA for lying. Right? What does establishment America do to liars? We don't fire them. We don't put them in prison. We give them certificates. We give them promotions.
Yep.
You fail upwards,
Totally.
right? And that's not only what we see with the agency, but we're still seeing it with a nice, pleasant exception with the Washington Post last week. The Washington Post covered the story. Golf clap for the Washington Post. New York Times still
Good.
refuses to cover this story. As I mentioned to you the last time we talked, I had an agent a long time ago who laughed in my face when I tried to pitch a JFK story to Esquire magazine. And he said, "Oh, Matt, you will learn. New York hates this story." It reveals their complicity in this cover-up. This is not just an assassination. This is not just a government cover-up. It's a media cover-up too. And that is what we should all be concerned about. We're not getting the truth about the environment. We're not getting the truth about the assassinations. We're not getting the truth about jobs and homes, everything that matters to us, immigration. All of this comes to us through a media. So if you're not concerned about the assassinations of the 60s, fine. But I know you're concerned about whatever it is that your kitchen table's talking about at night. And that is coming to you through a national media and an international media that's utterly captured.
Which all sort of comes back to what Mike Benz has been talking about in relationship to this. Just like you can see this, there's a payment there. There's a direct sort of train, and it doesn't, nobody's writing a check to the New York Times, but it's always kind of coming through these back doors of advertisements or payments or whatever it is. And it is really unique to see this sort of playing out, that you've got this pattern that keeps happening in Washington, at least in late 20th century Washington till now. You just see this consistent pattern with these guys. And I think it does start right here in these assassinations. You know, these guys, whether it's Mark Levin or Ben Shapiro saying, who cares about what happened in the JFK files? It's done and it's over. I think there's something why this, and I keep coming back to this stuff with Epstein, because you can't detach the two. They're the same operation. They're the same use of blackmail. They're the same use of sex. They're the same use of just sort of Washington's spider web of entanglement. And they do it both through the media. They do it through the politicians. They do it all the way through the whole story. It happened back then. It's happening again. It's happened all the way in between. And I just think that's just super, super unique. Oswald's a unique character in this to me, because here's this person that's really he really is. And he says it right out loud. I'm the patsy in this deal. And he's dead. And that's the case closed. And everybody can just put it away. It's on national television, this new medium that everybody's just glued to, and the whole story's done and it's over. That isn't working as well this time around. But I'm just curious, do you see that media connection, playing out over the last 70 years, really, in terms of what's happened since the assassination? Do you see that as something that was by design? Is there a mass conspiracy to that? Or is this just sort of the natural outcome of a government that has to have this communication device under control?
It's a great question. From my limited experience, my take on it is this, that it was not by design at the beginning. Let's go back to November 22nd, 1963. I think if you look at the Kennedy assassination as America sort of grows up from that day on, you see that there are courageous reporters in the mainstream media during those early years. There are people at the Washington Post, in the New York Times, NBC, CBS, ABC, young Bill O'Reilly, right? There are people they're giving their lives to cover this story. The most prominent female journalist of her time, according to Ernest Hemingway, the greatest female journalist of her time, Dorothy Kilgallen, a real celebrity in her time, was covering the JFK assassination and splashing it across headlines in 64 and 65. She was the only journalist to get an actual interview one-on-one with Jack Ruby, a man who did pin the assassination himself on Lyndon Johnson. So she gets this interview and is working on a book that she promises will just blow the case sky high. What happens to Dorothy Kilgallen? Like so many people who decided to tell this story or tried to tell this story, she died a mysterious death of an overdose, right? Like so many of Johnson's victims with their 5-bullet suicides and their carbon monoxide poisonings. We have these overdoses too. And she was one of the overdoses. And I think after a while, a lot of people in media just started to self-police. You started to realize, if I tell this story, one, I could die. Two, there's increasingly less money, less incentive for telling the truth. There's a lot of incentive for going along with an increasingly neocon narrative of war's good, right? Whether we're going to call it muscular liberalism or neoliberalism or neoconservatism, it makes money for a lot of people. It makes money for doctors. It makes money for journalists. It's just good for business. War is the health of the state, according to the philosopher Randolph Bourne. But as somebody said recently, it might have been Mike Benz. I can't remember who said it, but it's not the health of the state if your state is losing the war. But for many people in America, they have woken up to that fact that the odds are on war. If you really want to make money and you want to advance your career, don't talk about what Matt and Aaron are talking about here. Talk about war. Right. Find a good war, like the Ukraine war. It was really pitched to us as this great anti-imperialist war. Those of us in the anti-war community, we were told, this is anti-war. This is an anti-war war. You want a war on war? Get with the Ukraine crowd. This is an anti-imperialist war. They always find a way to pitch the new war as the good war. There's a lot of money to be made doing that. So yeah, I see this as a big problem.
It touches on some things that I wanted to get to too in this, which is the administrative states and the intelligence, specifically the intelligence agencies, absolute loathing of Russia and Soviet Union, and how I'm curious if you are seeing that undercurrent in these documents as you're reading them. I'm just always amazed that they can pin everything and anything upon Russia or the Soviet Union, and that is the sort of hair trigger that makes everybody jump, and sort of validates all of their experience and their whatever dastardliness they do. It's okay as long as it's anti-Russia. What is there anything in this that sort of points that I know there's a connection with the Soviet Union and Oswald, but there's also this really interesting softening of the relationship between Khrushchev and Kennedy that has to be an irritation that motivates some of this too. Is anything in the documentation pointing more to that?
Oh yeah, now we're getting somewhere, right? This is the elephant in the room. A historical arc that moves from McCarthyism to neo-McCarthyism, from a sort of Republican ecosystem that was going after liberals for being communists to a kind of Democratic ecosystem in our time that is going after increasingly Republicans for being not communist, but Russian, right? This is, I think, the arch rhetorical arc where we are seeing these same just insidious McCarthyist tools being used to destroy people like Tulsi Gabbard in our time and JFK in his own time. He was treated as a traitor and as a communist on the streets of Dallas on 11/22/63. That was the viral meme of that day, wanted for treason, a poster that was put all over the city, funded by the son of H.L. Hunt, a good friend of Lyndon Johnson. Then we get to our time period in Tulsi Gabbard. We got Hillary Clinton telling us that she's a Russian asset. right? And of course, they say that Donald Trump is a Russian asset. These people are evil. They're traitors. They are in bed with Russia. Well, what's so damn dangerous about Russia? Well, I don't think we make as much money in the military industrial complex if we don't have them as our enemy. And I think Kennedy was aware of that.
For sure.
And I think Khrushchev was aware of that. I think both of them were trying to end the Cold War in 1963. And when you ask the question about the files, are we seeing anything kind of illuminating along these lines? The answer is yes. Again, you're not going to see this in the New York Times, but credit another golf clap to NPR. They did actually cover this file a few years ago. In the late 90s, thanks to the ARRB, Assassination Records Review Board, there was a memo, an FBI memo from, I believe it was 1966, 1965, 1966, that was declassified showing that the FBI had been watching the KGB, just as the KGB had been watching us. And they had detected that the KGB, the largest foreign intelligence service in the world at that time, had been studying the Kennedy assassination. And they had come to their own conclusions, not in 2025, not in 1991 in light of Oliver Stone's movie JFK, but in 1965, while Lyndon Johnson was still president and the Vietnam War hadn't yet reached pitch escalation, they had come to their own systemic conclusion. And what was their conclusion? Lyndon Johnson did it. Same as Jackie Kennedy's conclusion that she articulated to Pamela Tournier, JFK, or her press secretary on the flight back from Dallas. Lyndon did it.
Yep.
The KGB, Soviet Union, Russia, they have known for a long time that we have been working a narrative over here that needs them in the crosshairs. Luckily, according to Jefferson Morley, who's really the great point man for the JFK assassination research community, Anna Paulina Luna, who is the Florida representative running the new JFK task force, she has apparently gotten cooperation from Russia to release all of the KGB files on the Kennedy assassination this fall.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a very big deal. I mean, I don't think people even know that's happening. That is
media won't cover it.
Significant thing, and is all things. No, they won't touch it, and it's really crazy. And that is a really interesting aspect to this because, Washington takes so stinking long to get anything done, and you just see it both in Tulsi's work and RFK's work and Trump's work to some degree. It is just a horribly slow.
Yeah.
And so to have this happening where you actually have something like that that's progress, I'll be curious what that does. I mean, you would know probably more than others how nervous that will make the intelligence community to sort of be exposed. Even in Trump's first term, you had the acting CIA director say we can't release these files. There's something in there that implicates them, like you say, not in any kind of the CIA did this, but this connection between the president of the United States, the vice president of the United States, the intelligence agency, the administrative state, the media, the sort of all ability to sort of, no one really is saying, that's a great line from the Oliver Stone stuff, right? No, it's like a turkey shoot. No one really knows where the bullets are coming from. Mm-hmm. And that's really the case of this too. No one really knows where the cover-up is happening, but it's happened. And to be able to sort of unthread that one piece at a time, it's a pretty significant development.
And it's a development that is getting done in contrast to what you describe, a world that often moves too slowly. It is actually getting done rather quickly in the case of the JFK task force. I mean, I would love to just give brief props to Tulsi for getting the files out as quickly as she has, to Anna Paulina Luna for not only holding this task force, but doing so with it seems, without a narrative in mind, actually allowing the truth to be told in public, even if the media won't cover it. And I'm thinking in particular of Abraham Bolden and his disclosure of being kidnapped by the Johnson administration and institutionalized. The first Black Secret Service agent kidnapped and institutionalized by the Johnson administration for challenging the Warren Commission. Tulsi and Anna have done an amazing job, and this liaison to their committee, Jefferson Morley, with his great blog, JFK Facts, they are getting the information out to people at, I wouldn't say lightning speed, but it's happening quickly, and it's
For
encouraging.
Washington, it's pretty quick.
Yeah.
Yes, for Washington,
They are
it's
becoming a declassification engine.
Yeah, it's really good.
It's good.
I want to pivot, if
Yeah.
we can, to RFK, because that's one. There's so much wrong with how that all went down in terms of not only just the investigation, the sort of, I mean, the LAPD did a terrible job that night for sure. But even beyond that, there's just a lot there that I think most people just, it seemed so, again, it's another thing that seems to have happened on TV, even though it was peripheral.
Yeah.
The gunshots and the sort of this replaying of everything that's going on. People just came to the conclusion that Sirhan was the guy that did it. End of the story. I remember growing up, my parents, that was it.
Yeah.
RFK, his brother, was killed by Sirhan. That's the end of it. There was nothing more to see there. That one was a much more ironclad case. But, the Four Died Trying movie opened my eyes to some really crazy stuff in that regard, with this idea that, there's way more bullets that are even in the gun. You have bullets coming from behind, bullets coming from the front. Paul Scheidel is injured by a bullet that would never have come from where Sirhan was standing. How did that happen? What are you seeing? And that one to me is just like a more kind of almost salacious deal, because no one's really talked about it.
Yeah. I should probably go here in a few minutes, just because I got to meet up with somebody here soon. But I'll tell you what I've seen very briefly. And I'll also say that, I think I can take folks into the weeds on the JFK stuff. I'm just starting to learn, on the RFK stuff. Maybe I've read more than a lot of people, but I'm not a Lisa Pease. You should really, you should invite Lisa on to talk about the RFK stuff. But I have been going into the files. And I would encourage people to look into the Rockefeller Commission files that have been released. We often talk about the House Select Committee and the Warren Commission, but there were files released through the Rockefeller Commission in '75 that show already two very important things. One, that the government knew that the primary data in the RFK autopsy runs totally counter to the official story of 1968, that there were too many shots, and that the decisive kill shot behind the ear came from about an inch away, and not one witness put Sirhan closer than 3 feet to Bobby. So this points to somebody who's not in front of him, but somebody who's directly behind him. Who is that? I think the most likely suspect is that ace security guard with CIA contacts, Thane Eugene Caesar, who actually had a .22 drawn in the pantry that night. Right? There are witnesses who saw that, but their stories have been suppressed. This entire report, this is, I think, very important to mention, was suppressed. It was censored, right? It was just released this year, telling us that our government thought it was radioactive, that we would know, that government investigators came to the conclusion that the primary documents told one story and the official media narrative told us something else. One other final thing I'll say about the RFK thing that I think is fruitful for people to look into is there was a woman named Sandra Serrano who was a Kennedy worker that night. And she encountered a woman in a polka dot dress and a male colleague running down the stairs afterwards saying, "We shot him. We killed Senator Kennedy." And she was not the only person to see this woman in a polka dot dress, who apparently is still alive to this day, living in Tarzana, California. She was one of many, but there are documents, many of them were public even before the 2025 release, that show meticulously the police interrogation transcript of Sandra Serrano. It shows the LAPD with their USAID, CIA cops, guys who were often just changing uniforms, working for these different outfits. They're interrogating Sandra Serrano, and over the course of hours, they are just brutalizing this woman. They are bullying her from a position of absolute conviction about hearing this, that there was a we and a woman in a polka dot dress, to somebody who basically doesn't know whether to shit or go blind. You know, she's absolutely confused and intimidated by the end of the interview and gives the cops what they want. I don't know. You know, that was clearly what they wanted. They wanted to drive her into a position of intimidation and uncertainty. And for those who are interested in that narrative about police brutality, here's a great example in the RFK assassination of cops brutalizing Sandra Serrano into submission.
Absolutely. Hey, I love this. So let's do it again. This is
Really
like
enjoyed it,
hours
man.
of work and conversation, and I'm always fascinated by doing it with you. So thanks for being on.
Thank you, Aaron.
And we'll see you down the road.
All right, man.
Yeah,
See ya.
great to talk. Hey.
Bye.